Nuestro próximo conferencista es vicepresidente Grupo de Supervisión de Riesgos Cibernéticos y de TI del Banco de la Reserva Federal de Nueva York. Los puestos anteriores incluyen CISO y Global Partner de Cloud Security Services en IBM, vicepresidente senior y CISO de Elsevier, vicepresidente de Gestión de Riesgos de JP Morgan Chase y otros puestos de alto nivel. David tiene una amplia experiencia en seguridad cibernética, privacidad, gestión de riesgos, cumplimiento normativo, continuidad empresarial, recuperación ante desastres, transformación en la nube y blockchain para servicios financieros. La conferencia de hoy, el emergente escenario de ciberseguridad y riesgo para los servicios financieros. Bienvenido, David CASS.
Hello, my name is David CASS. I'm the Vice President of Cyber and IT Risk for the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Today, I'll be talking about the emerging cybersecurity risk landscape for financial services. But first, I'd like to thank all the conference support team and Duak Usi for putting together such a great conference. So, as I mentioned, I am a regulator, so this presentation and the comments contained therein represent only my personal views and do not reflect those of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York or the Federal Reserve System. And this presentation is being offered for educational and informational uses only. So when we start talking about the emerging landscape, we need to kind of take a look at what are the current drivers for organizations. So when we start talking about what's the current landscape, so there's a huge amount of pressure for organizations to stay competitive in the business. And most organizations currently have pretty complex technology portfolios. Unless you're a brand new startup where you're saying we're only going to start with the newest technology, if you're an existing mid to large size organization, you have a pretty complex technology stack already. Other things that we're going to talk about are there's new regulations. So there's a significant amount of cloud-related regulations, there's privacy-related regulations, and we'll talk about that some more as we go on. And as well as we'll take a look at what are some of the emerging cyber threats. So as we start looking at the emerging threats, post-COVID, we've fundamentally changed the way we work in most cases. So now, for most cases, organizations did a very good job of getting their employees, getting their people home to be able to work from home, but that's also changed the dynamic, because now all of a sudden when you start thinking about insider threat, how do you monitor your users, now all of a sudden you have everybody working remotely, whereas usually monitoring your insiders, especially your privileged users, can be fairly easy if it's on a corporate type campus. Now all of a sudden everybody's remote and working from home, so organizations have to start thinking about, well, what does that mean in the way I look at my insider threat? It could be, maybe you're a financial services institution where you have highly regulated employees or traders where things need to be recorded and monitored. Now, all of a sudden, they've been working from home for close to 18 months. During that time period, do you still have the technology to be able to record those trades, monitor those trades, just like they were in the office? So those are some of the things to think about. Another thing that's changed a little bit is asset management. But asset management is one of those things that firms of all sizes struggle with. Now, especially in the race to get organizations, to get individuals to work from home, in a lot of cases, they had to procure additional laptops or additional computers and send those home with the employees. Now, the challenge to doing that has been from the fact that now are those assets recorded in the inventory for the firm? Do they have that hardened or golden image on it that the rest of the company puts on company-owned devices? So those are some things to start thinking about. And do you have that good inventory of where all of those assets are, as well as now, we've been working from home for close to 18 months. Employees change companies. Do you have a way of getting those assets back? Have you gotten those assets back? So those are some of the things to start thinking about. And then, third-party service providers. So outsourcing is nothing new for any of our organizations. However, when you've seen, I'd say, attacks like Excellion, SolarWinds, things like that, where they're third parties that provide critical services or critical software to other companies, now organizations have to kind of go back and rethink about the need for having them send in more than just a questionnaire or a checklist. you have to look at, okay, do I know what services my critical third-party providers are providing to me? Is it a business function? Is it software? Do I know where that software is being used in my organization? And, if it is software in that case, what have I done to validate that the organization has a good software development lifecycle in place that includes, things like code signing? It includes things like making sure that they're not publishing code into public repositories or other things like that. Another aspect of the emerging threats is why ransomware isn't anything new. There's ransomware and other destructive attacks out there that really force organizations to look at, well, how do we recover from an attack like this? It's more than just business continuity and disaster recovery. Now with the ransomware, where you have your whole business essentially locked up, you have to look at, well, if something like that happens, how do I get everybody back to work? How do I get the company functioning? Not just, can I restore this one database? Can I restore this email? So as we talked about some of the threat landscape, now we need to talk about, well, what significant changes in technology have recently occurred? And cloud is now, I'd say, close to 10 years old, probably, from that aspect of it. But cloud really forces a change in the way organizations do business, and we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. And when you look at AI and ML, a lot of organizations want to avail themselves of using artificial intelligence and machine learning, but then you have to start taking into consideration, well, what data do you have? Is it the right data? How do you train the models? How do you protect the models? And then we'll also talk about blockchain for a little bit, where again, the use of an append-only ledger may be appealing, but it may present certain challenges in countries that have certain privacy laws, since the data is never really deleted from a blockchain. It's an append only. And then we have this whole new concept that's coming out of digital assets, and whether that's the potential of cryptocurrency, whether it's an NFT or things like that. How do you back up and recover and protect those assets? Because if you have a major corruption, now since it's a digital asset, that asset may be completely gone if you can't recover it. So, these changes continue to be significant from the point of view that, when you look at cloud, you look at blockchain, you look at AI and ML, these technologies require a significant amount of integration with the business. So in other words, the technology team, the security team, they have to work very closely with the business, because process is going to change, some governance is going to change. You need to make sure that is capable of happening. And the silo model, that no longer works. The silo model where IT could go off or security could go off and they could build something, and it would just be an expectation that the business would adopt it. Cloud, AI, ML, blockchain, these all require very tight integration between information technology and security and the business, which kind of speaks to the last point, which is, as you're bringing on your IT and your security leadership, you need groups that really understand the nature of the business that they're doing. You can't just understand technology or understand security. You have to understand the business of the organization. All right, so now when we start talking about, well, how does this actually impact strategy? Organizations, when they plan, if they're planning a big digital transformation, strategy is, more than just a document. It needs to be revisited. You may do a 3-year strategy, but you need to revisit that every year to start looking at it from the perspective of, are we on track? What's changed with the external circumstances? Are we taking the right level of risk? So it needs to be a living document that gets revisited, and this way you can tell, are you on track? And another key thing is, when we start thinking about digital transformation, is the need for good governance. So, governance, for it to be effective, needs all the right representation from across the lines of business and the key leadership, not just from technology, not just from security. It needs to be a very well integrated process. And, as we talked about also, you need a periodic reevaluation of the strategy. So in other words, if you're planning maybe a big cloud transformation, you need to be planning probably at a 3 to 5 year cycle. You can't just say, here, we're going to plan a cloud strategy that's going to take 1 year. So maybe you measure key milestones and key accomplishments that happen within that year, but you need a longer planning horizon. If your planning horizon is too short, you won't really be able to accomplish the goals in order to achieve digital transformation. So now, we talked about some of the nature of technology. So now we're going to talk about, well, what specific areas really change as you adopt things like cloud, as you adopt things like AI and ML and blockchain. So one of the first things that changes is governance. So we kind of talked about governance as, governance really specifies the accountability framework and provides oversight to ensure, that risks are being appropriately managed and mitigated. So you want to have the right representation as part of the governance. It needs to be, the business, it needs to be IT leadership, it needs to be security leadership. And part of that governance is you want good organizational roles defined from that point of view. And you want a good understanding of what is the risk appetite for the company. So that's one of the key things that you need to reevaluate of, what is the actual governance process as you go to cloud. Because when you're starting to deploy at a much rapider fashion, you need good integrated governance. Another aspect that needs to be reevaluated as you adopt these new technologies is monitoring. Usually organizations are used to, monitoring their own data centers very well. But now as you adopt things like cloud, where it brings that shared responsibility model, you have to figure out, do you have the right level of visibility into cloud or into blockchain or into AI and ML that you expect? And if you don't, what are the gaps? And have you identified means of, mitigating those gaps or closing those gaps from that point of view? Which, is a good segue into those, security controls from that point of view. Because when you look at the security controls, you may be running a whole set of security controls within your own data center. But now as you look at either, a SaaS application or a cloud application in general, you want to map, here's the controls that you're currently using. You map those to the controls that are available into the cloud. And then you identify some controls may be the exact same. In other cases, you may need different controls to accomplish that same goal. But if you have that mapping, it makes the process a lot easier, because then you can decide that, okay, if there's a lot of controls that are missing, maybe that application or that level of application doesn't go to the cloud yet. But the nice thing about cloud and emerging technology is every 6 months, new features and functionality are coming out. And that's a good segue also into identity and access management. Because when we think of it from that perspective, now all of a sudden, where you may have had good identity access management because you're just managing your own data centers, now as organizations adopt cloud and they adopt SaaS products, that identity and access management needs to federate across all those different clouds or across the cloud and SaaS products that you're using. The last thing you want is have somebody leave your organization and then find out that you disconnected them, but only disconnected them from your internal data center, and now they still have access to whatever you had in the cloud. And the next part too is, as you adopt these new technologies, you need to reevaluate, what does your application security program look like? By that, I mean, if you're deploying an application within your own data centers, usually you have more flexibility that once the scans are done, that maybe there's a certain level of vulnerabilities that you're willing to accept, because you can put firewalls, you can put other products in front of that application. As you move to the cloud, you need to rethink how you're going to address that security, because maybe you want to revisit the fact that it's no longer good enough to allow a certain level of medium vulnerabilities in there. So you want to start thinking about that from that aspect of it. Oh, I think I duplicated the slide here by accident. So the only other two areas that are really new on this side is, when you look at the security skills gap, part of it is, as you adopt new technology, or as your organization adopts new technology, so not only do you need to assess the ability of the developers to, maybe adopt a DevOps model to work in cloud, you need to look at your own security team and your risk team from that point of view and make sure that you have the right level of skills. For instance, moving to the cloud, if you have infrastructure security people, they're used to dealing with the physical kit. They're used to dealing with firewall rules. They're used to dealing with the ACLs. They're used to dealing with that from that aspect of it. Moving to the cloud now all of a sudden means they need to learn infrastructure as code. So you might need to send them for training, not just on cloud, but on scripting. They might need to learn JSON. They might need to learn Perl, because they're going to have to be able to query, the cloud to get some of that security information that they need. And then data protection, we'll talk about data protection actually as we segue to the next slide. Data protection kind of brings that element of privacy, and there's lots of countries that have privacy laws on the books. So now as we kind of transition a little bit to the regulatory landscape, so there's more than 80 countries right now that have some kind of privacy laws on the books. And these privacy laws also address areas of data sovereignty from that aspect of it. So data sovereignty, you need to keep in mind, is not the same as data residency. If there are laws in certain countries that require data sovereignty, that might require the data to be resident within that own country. So you need to make sure that you have a good understanding of that. And then also, when you take a look at the laws that are relevant, Chile also has a law that's 19,628 that speaks to, the protection of personal data and privacy, and actually establishes privacy as a fundamental right. So as those new technologies are being adopted, you need to make sure that you can address the elements of the law that are required, whether it's knowing what information you hold on those citizens, or if it's the right to correction of that data, can you correct it from that point of view? Because usually that law provides data subjects the right to access, rectify, delete, and maybe block processing of certain elements of data. So if you're adopting a technology like blockchain or something like that, that's an append-only ledger, and you're using it for personal or private data, you need to think about, well, am I potentially violating that law? Because the blockchain is an append-only ledger. So you can modify data, but it gets written onto the next chain, but somewhere the original data is always there. So you need to think about, does that potentially create a violation? So those are some of the things to think about. And even within construct, as we talk about GDPR as well, where you have the right to be forgotten. If you're using a technology like that, where it's an append-only ledger, that data is never really gone from the ledger. So you have to think about, where am I using the technology? How am I using it? What's my regulatory landscape look like from that point of view? And what procedures do I have in place to help me stay compliant? And it's a similar thing with cloud regulations as well. We have the FFIEC joint statement on cloud for financial institutions, at least large financial institutions in the US. It kind of sets up guidelines as far as what we expect as a regulator for safety and soundness from that aspect of it. I could spend all day just talking about the law stuff, but I know, let me just see how we're doing for time here. All right, so I'm on time. So now part of it is, once you understand, your regulatory landscape, and these regulatory landscapes are getting more and more complicated. New regulations come out, new technology comes out. So part of it now is, how do you understand your risk profile of your organization, and fundamentally, how has that risk profile changed? So you might have a well-established risk profile, and part of this goes back to needing to revisit your risk profile on an annual basis. So part of understanding where or how did your risk profile change is looking at, well, what's changed in your organization. So let's say you've started using cloud. It's very important to understand how are you consuming cloud. So there's 3 major models of how organizations use cloud. So the first one is infrastructure as a service. The second one is platform as a service. And the third major model is software as a service. So as your organization is using cloud in these different formats, it brings what we call shared responsibility. So in other words, when you outsource something, you usually give an organization, here's your run book, here's your security process, here's all the instructions, everything that I expect you to follow. Now, when you go to cloud, since it's a commodity-based product, you can't say, here, follow all of my, here's my security run book, here's all the controls I expect. Cloud is a commodity product, so you have to look at it from the point of view and figure out, well, as the company, what are you responsible for? And then what is the cloud service provider responsible for? So if you're running infrastructure as a service, you might be responsible for almost everything as the tenant. Whereas if you're running platform as a service, now your responsibility is split almost 50-50 between yourself and the cloud service provider. So your company may only be responsible for things like the operating system and up, and the cloud service provider may be responsible for the hypervisor and everything below. But you need a clear document that shows who's responsible for what, because as we talked about monitoring and things like that earlier, if you don't know what you're responsible for, and what the cloud service provider is responsible for, there's no good way that you're going to be able to effectively monitor it. And it's the same thing where we talk about shared responsibility. So shared responsibility means you and your cloud service provider or you and your outsourced provider have to work closely together. It's not the same thing as accountability. At the end of the day, the company is responsible or accountable for what they decided to outsource. And the other construct we have to start thinking about too is, resiliency. So by resiliency, I mean not just doing business continuity and disaster recovery. So it used to be for business continuity and disaster recovery, I know how long it's going to take me to recover this database. I know how long it takes me to recover this accounting ledger. I know how long it takes me to recover this email system. With attacks like ransomware that essentially stop the business from working completely because they encrypt everything from end to end, organizations need to start thinking about, well, not the recovery time for this one database, but what are my critical services across the way? And how do I recover that full service in the event that I have a major data corruption or that I have a major, ransomware type of an issue? So those are things to think about also. And then, the other thing to start thinking about, although, it's probably early on yet, is concentration risk. When you start outsourcing, whether it's to cloud or to other services, at what point in time are you outsourcing so much that it brings additional risk? So you need some way of kind of monitoring and measuring that, to make sure that your risk profile for the company hasn't changed significantly. So another thing is we're talking about, adoption of new technology and how does it change your risk profile? So let's say now all of a sudden you want to adopt AI and ML. So as you adopt the AI and ML, things to start thinking about, that's a typo there. The I as PAS and SAS shouldn't be there. But for the AI and ML, the key thing to think about is model risk management. So now how are you managing these AI and machine learning models? How are you testing these models to make sure that there's no bias in them? And from a model security point of view, how do you protect those models to make sure that they don't get corrupted or they don't get stolen? So for instance, let's just say maybe you spend $10 million creating a AI model that helps investors balance their portfolios. And you make it available to the public so they can sign on and start testing it. So if you don't put certain boundaries around that model, if I send enough data to that model and it keeps sending, and it keeps sending me back the results, I may be able to steal your model and recreate that model with about an 80–85% confidence interval. So you need to think about how do you prevent your model from being stolen? How do you prevent it from being corrupted? And when do you detect model drift where you need to go in and kind of retrain the model from that aspect of it? So that's one of the things to think about. So now another aspect of understanding your risk profile is you may adopt new technology and things like that. Blockchain, you need to think about, well, one, what are you trying to solve with an append-only ledger? And we go very technically deep on blockchain, but we don't really have time. But some of the key elements to start thinking about is, as your organization is thinking about adopting blockchain, is it permissionless? If it's going to be permissionless, that's the public blockchain or public versions of blockchain. And there's lots of open source public blockchain that's available. So you need to think about, well, which one, why, what problem are we solving? If it's permissioned blockchain, odds are maybe that means it's going to be a private blockchain, and maybe it's just a group of companies that are getting together, from a supply chain point of view. And then if it is permissioned, then you need to think about the governance model. So if it's, maybe 5–10 companies getting together, how are changes to the blockchain going to be managed? How is it going to be governed? Because now all of a sudden, if it was a single database owned by your company, you're used to providing the governance over that database. That one company decides when does it get upgraded, how does it get upgraded. Now, all of a sudden, if you're using a blockchain or an append-only kind of ledger, now governance is frequently done by all the different members of that group, and they may have different elements of control, or it may be a majority vote. So those are some of the things to think about. And also, if you're adopting blockchain too, if it's public versus private, there's certain key elements of security that you need to think about. There's certain Sybil attacks. There's certain how many nodes are out there. Could the whole thing be overwritten? Because while blockchain is tamper resistant, it's not hack proof. So you need to start thinking about those things from that element of it. And I think the last slide that I have, or almost the last slide, make sure I'm still on time here, is, so what's effective risk management look like for an organization? So the first thing kind of goes back to what we started talking about at the very beginning of, what's good governance? Do you have the right level of executive management presence? Do you have the right level of technical and business representation there, and the right level of security there? And then the other element of it is, as you look at information security, you want to look at it through a risk lens, not just an information security lens. As you say, okay, as we adopt these controls or adopt these technologies, what's the risk that it's mitigating? Is there residual risk left that we need to know about? And is there a way to measure it and respond to it? So part of effective risk management is, how do we measure it? Does it roll up to your operational risk committee? Does it go somewhere to a different committee? And as these risks are being identified and measured, how do you respond to them? Because you can accept a risk, you can treat a risk, either adding through controls, or you can insure against risks. So, but you need to have some kind of response to it. So it's one thing to just have the list of all the risks identified, but you need to identify how are they being treated, how are they being responded to. Is there any significant residual risk that you need to be aware of? And then the next part is essentially, as technology is bringing, as the business is adopting new technology and the information technology teams are bringing in that new technology, you need to have the ability to mount an effective challenge. So by mounting an effective challenge, let's just say, if you're probably a large size organization, you have an information security team, which is often the first line. You may have a risk team or an IT risk team, which is your second line of defense. And then you probably have an internal audit team, which is usually the third line of defense, is kind of how we speak about these things. So if your technology team and your security team are within that first line, the ability to mount an effective challenge also means that, okay, in your IT risk team, if you're adopting AI and machine learning, or if you're adopting cloud and other emerging technologies, you need to make sure that you have the right level of expertise within your risk team and within your audit team, that you can ask the right questions about, why were certain decisions made. If, all the knowledge resides in the first line, it's going to be very hard for your risk team and your audit teams to mount an effective challenge. And that also speaks to the last part, which is really, integrated teams and the ability to have a good cross-functional team across the whole business organization and have the right level of representation there. So that's really all I had for this, session at the time. Feel free to connect on, LinkedIn or on Twitter. Thank you so much for having me as a speaker. I always enjoy these conferences, and I hope to be able to join everyone in person when these conferences return to in person.